The Bible commands us in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 to be able to give a reasonable defense of our faith. This episode will continue to explain how the order in the fossil record can be explained by the Genesis flood and demonstrate how radiometric dating methods do not provide conclusive evidence for the evolutionary timescale. Evolutionists claim that dinosaurs are the ancestors of birds. However, this claim crumbles under the evolutionary dating method. The supposed transitional forms between dinosaurs and birds are millions of years younger than Archaeopteryx and Confuciusornis, which are both fully formed birds. How could the supposed transitional ancestors of birds be millions of years younger than actual birds? The claim that a meteor caused the dinosaurs to go extinct is based off of a fallacious interpretation of the iridium enrichment layer found in rocks. Based on a young Earth creation model, one would predict that iridium enrichment would occur as a result of volcanic activity during the flood year, when the fountains of the Great Deep broke open and triggered volcanic eruptions. There is a general pattern to the fossil record because of the Genesis flood. Sea creatures that are either bottom-dwelling or generally stagnant or stationary are buried in the lower strata. Land vertebrates, due to their mobility, are found in the upper layers of the strata. The fact that the fossil record is the result of the catastrophic effects of the Genesis flood is evident when one considers that the majority of the fossils are invertebrate sea creatures, or plant matter in a coal or oil condition, because vertebrates and human beings would have been able to evade the effects of the flood for the longest. Further explanation will be given in the following points. $10 million antediluvian people distributed consistently during the whole of 700 million cubic kilometers would only yield one human fossil every 70 cubic kilometers of rock. Thus, you would be hard-pressed to find even one human fossil. The Genesis flood would start with the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open. The fountains of the Great Deep breaking open would first bury bottom-dwelling sea creatures due to the fact that they're relatively immobile or stationary. Land creatures would be buried last because the floodwaters from the fountains of the Great Deep would cover the land last. Water-based plants would generally be buried before land-based swamp plants, and plants in swamps would naturally be submerged and buried before plants that are more inland. Due to the fact that dinosaurs most likely inhabited estuaries or swamps like crocodiles, one would not expect to find human beings or other inland creatures to be buried with dinosaurs, as the habitats are different. Organisms that would be more likely to evade the effects of the Genesis flood the longest will be organisms with greater intelligence and mobility. Organisms like the land animals, or especially birds, would attempt to evade the effects of the flood for as long as they could. Another reason why human fossils are rare is precisely because the antediluvian people would do all they could, whether by clinging to debris, logs, and even makeshift rafts, in an attempt to gain higher ground and escape the effects of the flood. Eventually, the antediluvian people would perish. Human remains have a tendency to bloat in water and thereby float. This would lead to the remains being scavenged by fish, and thus the skeletons would demineralize or break down in the Genesis flood waters and make human fossils a rarity. Intelligent animals would attempt to evade the effects of the flood and thus would hold out the longest. The fact that these animals resisted destruction or attempted to survive longer would in turn lead to them being more susceptible to being eroded by the floodwaters that were receding when the Genesis flood ended. Due to the fact that the remains of the more intelligent creatures would tend to be eliminated, one would not expect to find many creatures of varying intelligence and mobility buried together, meaning one would not expect to find a human or a cow buried with the less agile dinosaurs. During the early stages of the flood, when the waters are rising and the fountains of the great deep are breaking open, the sedentary sea life, such as clams, trilobites, etc., would be buried. The destruction of marine life would continue as the floodwaters were picking up speed and carrying sediments along with them. Sea creatures that exercised their mobility, or the swimming sea creatures like the coelacanth, were buried next. The floodwaters and the terrific downpour of rain envelop the land, and the organisms that dwell on the seashores or the rivers are buried next. At this point, massive sheets of sediments are being laid down, and everything from small mammals, amphibians, dinosaurs, forests, etc. are being buried and destroyed by the flood. The animals buried in the final stage were the ones that held out the longest, and this would include mammals, birds, and forests that were on higher ground to begin with. Observing the phases as a whole, we see the general trend is that the flood tended to bury the creatures generally in accordance with both their intelligence and their mobility, and that the flood started with the marine life before moving on to the terrestrial life. I pray that you enjoyed this episode of Genesis Under a Microscope, and that you will subscribe to Christ Jesus Ministries YouTube channel. For more faith-building content, continue to watch the rest of the episodes in this series. Please see the description, where you will also find a study guide on this video's topic. Take note of the fact that you were intelligently designed, and remember, the truth saves.